There is a story that has circulated in financial circles for 2 centuries. It is told in banking houses and economics classrooms and investment firms and late-night conversations between people who find the intersection of money and power endlessly fascinating. It has been repeated so many times, in so many versions, that it has taken on the quality of myth. And like all good myths, it contains within it a truth that survives even when the specific details are disputed. The story goes like this. On the 18th of June, 1815, the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte met the forces of the Duke of Wellington on a muddy Belgian field near a village called Waterloo. The battle that followed was one of the most consequential military engagements in European history. Napoleon's defeat that day ended 20 years of French Revolutionary and Napoleonic wars that had consumed the continent, destabilized every major European power, and left the financial markets of London in a state of chronic uncertainty. Everyone knew that if Napoleon won at Waterloo, the consequences for Britain would be catastrophic. If Wellington won, the relief would send British government bonds, known as consols, soaring in value. Everyone in London was waiting for news. The fastest communication technology available in 1815 was a man on a fast horse. Under normal circumstances, news from the battlefield in Belgium took the better part of 2 days to reach London. The financial markets were suspended in a state of collective anxiety, unable to price anything accurately because the most important variable in the entire European economic equation remained unknown. That is the story. That Nathan Rothschild, the London head of the most powerful banking dynasty in Europe, received intelligence of Wellington's victory at Waterloo before the British government did, before the markets did, before anyone else in the city had any idea which way the battle had gone. And that he used that information to execute a series of financial maneuvers that made him a fortune of almost incomprehensible size, cementing the Rothschild family's position as the dominant financial power in Europe for the next century. The story has been told as a tale of genius, as a tale of conspiracy, as a tale of Jewish financial cunning, in the uglier versions that antisemitic propagandists have weaponized it into over the decades. It has been cited as evidence of the inevitable corruption of financial markets, as proof that information is the ultimate currency, and as the founding myth of insider trading. It has inspired novels and films and political pamphlets and economic treatises. And the truth of it, the actual documented historical truth, is considerably more complicated, more nuanced, and in several important respects more interesting than any of the versions that have circulated in its place. To understand what Nathan Rothschild actually did around the time of Waterloo, and why it matters, you first have to understand who the Rothschilds were and how they had built the financial infrastructure that made what they did possible. Because the Waterloo story did not happen in isolation. It happened as the culmination of a decades-long project of financial innovation and network building that was, in its own way, as revolutionary as anything happening on the battlefield at the same time. The Rothschild dynasty began in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Germany, in the mid-18th century. Mayer Rothschild, the patriarch of the family, was a coin dealer and small-scale financial agent who built his business on a combination of expertise, reliability, and an extraordinary instinct for cultivating relationships with powerful people. He became financial agent to Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse, one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe, a man who had made a fortune hiring out his subjects as soldiers to foreign powers, most famously to the British during the American Revolutionary War. Managing Wilhelm's enormous and complex financial affairs gave Mayer both capital and credibility, the 2 things that a banking operation needs above everything else to grow. But Mayer true genius was not financial. It was organizational. He had 5 sons, and he deployed them across the major financial capitals of Europe with the strategic precision of a general positioning his forces. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt to manage the family headquarters. Salomon went to Vienna. Karl went to Naples. Jacob, who called himself James, went to Paris. And Nathan, the most commercially aggressive and financially gifted of the 5, went to England. First to Manchester, where he made a substantial fortune in the textile trade, and then to London, where he established the banking house that would become the most powerful financial institution in the world. What the 5 brothers created, operating in concert across 5 cities in 5 countries, was something that had never existed before in the history of finance. An international banking network with shared intelligence, shared capital, and shared strategy, capable of moving money and information across borders faster and more reliably than any government or competing institution. They communicated through a courier system that was faster than the official postal services of the countries they operated in. They shared market intelligence across their network in real time, or as close to real time as the technology of the early 19th century permitted. They operated, in effect, as a single financial organism distributed across the continent, with each brother serving as a node in a network whose collective power vastly exceeded the sum of its individual parts. This network was the real story behind the Waterloo legend. Nathan Rothschild did not simply get lucky with a piece of battlefield intelligence. He had spent years building the infrastructure that made it possible to receive, process, and act on information faster than anyone else in the market. The question of whether he actually profited from advanced knowledge of Waterloo's outcome, and how exactly he did it, is where the history gets complicated. And it is where we need to go carefully, because the gap between the legend and the documented record is both significant and revealing. The legend says that Nathan Rothschild received news of Wellington's victory via a private courier who crossed the channel ahead of the government's own messenger. Armed with this intelligence, he went to the floor of the London Stock Exchange and began selling consols, British government bonds, in large quantities. The other traders, seeing Rothschild selling, assumed he had received bad news from the battlefield. They concluded that Napoleon had won. They began selling their own consols in panic. The price of consols collapsed. And then, at the bottom of the market, Rothschild secretly bought everything back at the depressed price. When the government's messenger finally arrived with news of Wellington's victory, the price of consols recovered and Rothschild's secretly acquired position made him a fortune that some accounts put at over £1 million, an almost unimaginable sum in 1815. It is a perfect story. Almost too perfect. And that perfection is itself a reason to look at it carefully before accepting it as history. The documented historical record around Nathan Rothschild and Waterloo is both more complicated and more interesting than the legend suggests. Let us start with what we can actually verify. It is true that the Rothschild courier network was faster than most official government communication channels in 1815. This is not disputed. The family had invested heavily in building a private intelligence and courier system that operated across Europe with a speed and reliability that governments genuinely envied. Nathan Rothschild himself acknowledged in later life that he had received news of Waterloo's outcome before the official government dispatch arrived in London. That part of the story is real. What is considerably less clear is exactly what he did with that information and how much money he made doing it. The primary source for the most dramatic version of the story, the deliberate selling to create panic followed by secret buying at the bottom, is a pamphlet published in France in 1846, more than 30 years after the events it describes, by a man named Georges Mathieu Danval writing under the pseudonym Satan. This is not, to put it gently, the most reliable foundation for a historical claim. Danval was an antisemitic polemicist who was not present at the London Stock Exchange in 1815 and who had obvious ideological reasons for wanting to portray the Rothschilds as manipulative financial predators who had profited from the suffering of others. His account is vivid, detailed, and almost entirely unsupported by contemporary documentation. The actual records of Nathan Rothschild's trading activity around the time of Waterloo tell a more nuanced story. Historians who have gone through the Rothschild archive in London, which is one of the most extraordinarily well-preserved private financial archives in existence, have found evidence that Nathan was indeed active in the bond markets in the days surrounding Waterloo. But the pattern of his trading does not clearly match the legend of deliberate panic selling followed by opportunistic buying. What the records suggest is something rather different and in some ways more sophisticated than the simple pump and dump scheme of the popular account. In the months leading up to Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild had been deeply involved in financing the British war effort. He was handling the logistics of moving British gold to Wellington's army on the continent, a task of staggering complexity that involved converting sterling into multiple continental currencies and physically transporting enormous quantities of gold across a Europe that was in the middle of a war. He had built up significant positions in British government bonds as part of this financing operation. His financial exposure to the outcome of the war was therefore not the purely speculative position of a trader looking for an edge. It was the deeply entangled position of a banker who had bet his institution's capital on a British victory and needed that victory to happen to avoid catastrophic losses. When news of Wellington's victory arrived through the Rothschild courier network, Nathan's most pressing concern was not how to profit from the information asymmetry. It was how to manage the enormous and complex financial positions he already held and to ensure that the money owed to him by the British government for his financing services was secured before the chaotic post-battle settlement period created opportunities for others to complicate his claims. The genius of what he did in the days following Waterloo was not the dramatic stock market manipulation of the legend. It was the quiet, methodical, and extraordinarily skillful management of a financial position of almost incomprehensible complexity under conditions of extreme uncertainty and time pressure. He did make money. A great deal of money. The estimates vary, but the Rothschild family's wealth increased substantially in the period around Waterloo and its aftermath. But the mechanism was less the theatrical stock market manipulation of the legend and more the grinding, sophisticated work of a banker who had built better systems, had better information, and could process that information faster than any of his competitors. It was, in other words, a story about infrastructure and intelligence rather than a story about a single dramatic trade. This distinction matters enormously, and not just for the sake of historical accuracy. Because the legend version of the Waterloo story, the deliberate panic selling, the secret buying, the single dramatic manipulation, is a story about an individual act of genius or villainy depending on your perspective. But the true version is a story about a system. A story about what happens when one actor in a market has invested so heavily in information infrastructure that they operate in a fundamentally different informational environment than everyone else. They are not cheating in the conventional sense. They are playing a different game on the same board, a game whose rules they have helped design and whose advantages they have built over years of patient, deliberate investment. That is a more disturbing story than the legend in some ways. Because it does not require a conspiracy. It does not require deliberate manipulation or bad faith. It simply requires the kind of structural advantage that comes from being better connected, better informed, and better organized than your competitors. And that kind of advantage, unlike outright fraud, is very difficult to legislate against, very difficult to even identify as a problem, because from the outside it looks indistinguishable from simply being better at the job. Brothers who trusted each other enough to move money across borders on each other's word alone. It was, in other words, a family business taken to its logical extreme. The conspiracy theory was not just morally reprehensible. It was analytically wrong. It explained a structural phenomenon through the lens of individual villainy because individual villainy is easier to understand and easier to hate than systemic advantage. The Rothschild family understood this. They understood it with a clarity that their contemporaries and their critics often did not. The antisemitic versions of the Waterloo story, which proliferated throughout the 19th century and metastasized into genuinely dangerous political propaganda in the 20th, framed the Rothschild advantage as something sinister and alien, a Jewish conspiracy against Christian Europe. But the actual mechanism of that advantage was not sinister or alien or conspiratorial. It was courier routes and correspondent networks and shared capital and brothers who trusted each other enough to move money across borders on each other's word alone. It was, in other words, a family business taken to its logical extreme. The conspiracy theory was not just morally reprehensible. It was analytically wrong. It explained a structural phenomenon through the lens of individual villainy because individual villainy is easier to understand and easier to hate than systemic advantage. What the Rothschilds had built by 1815 was not a conspiracy. It was a prototype. A prototype of the kind of information advantage that would come to define financial markets in the centuries that followed. The telegraph, the telephone, the ticker tape, the Bloomberg terminal, the algorithmic trading system that processes market information in microseconds and executes trades faster than any human being can think, these are all, in their different ways, descendants of the Rothschild courier network. The race to be first, to have better information faster and to act on it before the market catches up, is the oldest race in the history of finance. Nathan Rothschild did not invent it, but he ran it better than anyone had before him. And in doing so he helped establish it as the defining competition of the modern financial world. The irony is that the legend, the dramatic version with the panic selling and the secret buying, is remembered while the true story, which is considerably more significant and considerably more relevant to how financial markets actually work, has been largely lost inside the myth. The legend is a story about one trade. The truth is a story about the birth of information asymmetry as the central organizing principle of global finance. And that truth, properly understood, explains not just what Nathan Rothschild did in 1815 but what hedge funds and high-frequency traders and private equity firms are doing today with tools that Rothschild could not have imagined but would almost certainly have recognized. The game has not changed. The technology has. There is a question that hangs over the entire Rothschild-Waterloo story, and it is the question that makes it relevant beyond the specific historical moment it describes. The question is this. If one actor in a market has access to better information than everyone else, and uses that information to profit at the expense of people who are operating with less complete knowledge of the situation, Is that genius or is that theft? The answer that financial markets have given to that question, over the 2 centuries since Waterloo, has been deeply inconsistent. And the inconsistency reveals something important about the values that actually govern the global economy, as opposed to the values that the global economy claims to be governed by. In the years immediately following Waterloo, the kind of information advantage that the Rothschilds had built was not illegal. It was not regulated. It was not even widely recognized as a distinct category of market activity that might require rules. It was simply the reward for having invested in better systems. The market, in the ideology that was already beginning to calcify into economic orthodoxy by the early 19th century, was a neutral mechanism that processed information and allocated resources efficiently. If some participants had better information than others, the market would incorporate that information into prices and everyone would benefit from the resulting efficiency. The idea that information asymmetry might be a form of structural unfairness that undermined the market's claim to neutrality was not part of the conversation. It took another century and a half and several spectacular financial scandals before the concept of insider trading was formally codified into law in most major financial jurisdictions. The United States began developing serious insider trading regulation in the 1930s in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash and the revelations of market manipulation that the subsequent investigations uncovered. Britain did not have meaningful insider trading legislation until 1980. The European Union did not harmonize insider trading rules across member states until the 1990s. The global financial system operated for the better part of 2 centuries after Waterloo without any meaningful legal framework governing the use of privileged information in financial markets. And even after those frameworks were established, the line between legal information advantage and illegal insider trading remained, and remains, extraordinarily difficult to draw with precision. The hedge fund manager who spends millions of dollars building a research operation that processes publicly available information faster and more thoroughly than any competitor and uses the resulting insights to trade profitably is doing something that is legally and morally unimpeachable. The hedge fund manager who receives a phone call from a company insider telling him about an unannounced acquisition and trades on that information is committing a crime. But the practical difference between those 2 scenarios, in terms of the information asymmetry they create and the advantage they confer, is one of degree rather than kind. The first manager knows something the market does not yet know because he has invested in finding it out. The second knows something the market does not know because someone told him. In both cases, the other participants in the market are trading against someone who has a fundamentally different and superior understanding of the situation. Nathan Rothschild sat somewhere in the complicated territory between those 2 positions. His information advantage was real. It was structural. It was the product of deliberate investment in courier networks and correspondent relationships and family coordination. It was not the product of someone whispering a secret in his ear, or at least not primarily. But it was also not the product of analysis that any well-resourced competitor could have replicated given the same inputs. It was the product of a proprietary system that gave him access to information that was, in practical terms, unavailable to anyone else in the London market at the same moment. The modern financial world has largely resolved this ambiguity in favor of the information advantage. High-frequency trading firms spend hundreds of millions of dollars locating their servers as physically close as possible to stock exchange matching engines so that their trade orders arrive microseconds faster than competitors. Hedge funds hire former government officials and central bank economists and use their expertise and connections to anticipate policy decisions before they are publicly announced. Private equity firms conduct extensive due diligence on acquisition targets using networks of industry contacts that provide insights unavailable to ordinary investors. None of this is illegal. Most of it is not even widely considered unethical. It is simply the cost of admission to the upper tier of modern financial competition. Nathan Rothschild would have recognized all of it immediately. He would have recognized the logic, the value of speed, the value of networks, the value of being the person in the room who knows something that the other people in the room do not yet know. He built his career and his family's dynasty on exactly that logic, and the world he helped build has never seriously questioned whether that logic is the right foundation for a system that claims to allocate the world's resources fairly and efficiently. The Waterloo legend has endured not because it is accurate, but because it captures something true about the nature of financial power that the accurate version struggles to convey with the same clarity. The legend says that one man, with one piece of information, at one dramatic moment, changed his family's fortunes and shaped the financial history of the world. The truth says that a family, over generations, built a system of such extraordinary sophistication that they operated in a different informational universe than their competitors, and that the advantages of that system compounded over time into a dominance so complete that it became structural rather than merely competitive. The legend is more satisfying because it has a clear actor and a clear moment and a clear moral. The truth is more disturbing because it has no clear moment of wrongdoing, no obvious point at which someone could have intervened and said this is not fair, no villain in the conventional sense. The truth is a story about how advantage, built legitimately and deployed skillfully, becomes self-perpetuating. How the family that can move money faster builds more capital. How more capital funds better intelligence networks. How better intelligence networks generate more profitable trades. How more profitable trades generate more capital. The wheel turns, and with each revolution the gap between the Rothschilds and everyone else grows wider. Not because anyone is cheating, but because the system rewards the advantages they have built with more advantages. That is the story the Waterloo legend was always really telling, even in its most distorted and mythologized versions. Not the story of a single trade. Not the story of Jewish conspiracy or financial villainy or individual genius. The story of what happens when information becomes the most valuable commodity in a market, and one actor figures out how to corner the supply of it before anyone else has fully understood that the race has begun. The Rothschilds won that race in 1815. The race itself has never ended. It has simply moved to faster infrastructure and shorter timeframes and higher stakes. The firms competing in it today have names that are not Rothschild. But the game they are playing is the same game Nathan Rothschild played on the floor of the London Stock Exchange in the days after Waterloo, with couriers and correspondent brothers and a private intelligence network that saw the world a few hours before everyone else. A few hours was enough then. A few microseconds is enough now. The technology changes. The advantage endures. And the question of whether that advantage is genius or something else, something that the comfortable language of financial markets has never quite found the right word for, remains as unanswered today as it was when the first version of the Waterloo story began circulating in the coffee houses of London in the summer of 1815. Some questions are not answered by history. They are only sharpened by it. And the sharpest version of this one cuts both ways. If Nathan Rothschild was a genius for building a system that let him know things before other people knew them, what are we to make of the world his genius helped build? A world where the race for information advantage has never stopped accelerating. Where the gap between those inside the information and those outside it has never stopped widening. Where the Waterloo trade, in 1,000 different forms and at 1,000 different speeds, is being executed every second of every trading day on every exchange on Earth. The battle ended in 1815. The trade never did.